Hello, History 131 students. This is the third lecture or second lecture, depending on whether you count the introduction lecture I uploaded for you. Hope everything is well and school is getting off to a good start. Uh, Hopefully, you're staying safe and protecting yourself from this deadly pandemic that we're in the middle of. Last week, we introduced you to the Mesopotamians. There are three groups. They are Semitic. The first group would be the Sumerians, the second group would be the Akkadians, the third group would be the Babylonians. So this is Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. The rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates River. But today we're moving south, away from Southwest Asia, onto the northeast corner of the African continent. And the civilization is Egypt, sometimes referred to as the gift of the Nile. Believe it or not, just like in Mesopotamia, civilization could not have taken hold without the rivers. But in Egypt, there's only one river, the Nile River, which begins in Ethiopia and flows for hundreds of miles north and empties into the Mediterranean Sea, creating a broad delta. Each summer, the Nile would flood and bring with it the rich black soil from Ethiopia and Africa and deposit it in the delta. And this uh, black soil was very fertile, which allowed this civilization to take hold, to grow crops, to domesticate animals, and develop a civilization. It became known as the Black Land, a Kemet, Egypt. Now, this civilization uh, was organized in 3100 BCE. What is that? That's 5,022 years ago. And the organizer is the legendary King Menzies, Menes. This will be on your study guide. Uh, he unified Upper and Lower Egypt in 3100 BCE. Now, Egyptian history is organized in dynasties. You have the old dynasty, kingdoms, I'm sorry, not dynasty, that's China. The old, middle, and new kingdom. So Menzies would be the first pharaoh. The Egyptian called their king pharaoh. And of course, you had mostly male pharaohs, but throughout the history of Egypt, you would have some female pharaohs also. We'll talk more about that. But basically, the creativity of the Nile allowed this civilization to develop, and it is fascinating. Uh, you've seen movies, you've seen cartoons, you've seen everything discussing this Egyptian civilization. Uh, they, I don't know if you can even group them in a racial category because obviously you had black African influence from the South, you had Semitic influence from the Middle East, and later you have Berbers. But there are mixtures of race, which include the Romans and the Greeks. We're going to talk more about that as we get into Greek and Roman history. Um, but a very mixed society. What do we know about this old kingdom? It covers from about 2700 to 2200 BCE. And of course, the old kingdom capital was at Memphis. Sound familiar, doesn't it? But this is where uh, the Pharaoh considered to be godlike, equivalent to a god, and it ushered in divine order. Uh, Now, what else do I want to tell you? Egypt produced cultural that dazzled and awe us even today. I remember watching the last Transformer movie, maybe another one out since, where Optimus Prime is battling the evil Transformer at the Great Pyramid of Khufu. These pyramids we're going to talk more about, but the pyramids were tied to the spiritual life of the Egyptian, the idea of an afterlife. And this led to the building of perfect triangles. Can you imagine doing so, the size of these pyramids today without the help of computers, slide rules, measuring tapes, but mainly through man-made tools and, of course, slave labor to move huge building blocks to build the pyramid. And, of course, the Great Pyramid at Giza represents this building process. Okay, so the Egyptian started out, their religion was tied to the Nile and the Pharaoh, and they had a number of gods associated with heavenly bodies and natural forces. Two groups were considered to be the most important: sun gods, land gods. They were prominent. The sun was the source of life on earth, and they called this cult, this god Ra, Amun, son of Ra. The river and land deities included Osiris and Isis. Now, this is an interesting story. And with Osiris was the male god, and Isis was female goddess, and they had a child called Horus, who was related to the Nile and to the sun as well. Now, Osiris became important as a symbol of resurrection or rebirth. Now, the Mesopotamians didn't talk about rebirth, but here we go with the introduction of resurrection. Osiris became the judge of the dead. Now, this is how this started off as a myth told of the struggle between Osiris, who supposedly brought civilization to Egypt, and his evil brother Seth, who killed him, cut his body into 14 parts, and tossed them into the Nile River. Osiris' faithful wife Isis found the pieces, and with the help of other gods, restored Osiris to life. Thus, he became the judge of the dead. By identifying with Osiris, one could hope to gain new life, just as Osiris had done. So, this pyramid building was built for a tomb. That's a tomb for the Pharaoh on his journey to the afterlife. Very interesting concept, but they exist. And these are magnificent structures, but they were built and dedicated to the dead. Now, in art and writing, what can we say about the Egyptian? You've seen the drawings, and we've talked about the building structure. But the Egyptian developed a new style of writing. I don't know which is older, the cuneiform in Mesopotamia, mud-shaped clay tablet writing, or hieroglyphics, which is developed from the reeds that grow in the Nile. They are matted together and allowed to dry and develop paper. Today we think of paper that comes from pine trees, but this is from the papyrus reed that grow in the Nile River Valley. And they developed a writing called hieroglyphic or priest carving. Don't forget that. So the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, but when we get into the New Kingdom, up until this point, Egypt had been isolated and allowed to develop its own culture and techniques. Now, during the New Kingdom, Egypt becomes subject to invaders. Remember, we talked about the Mesopotamians, first the Sumerians, they were conquered by the Akkadians was conquered by the Babylonians. This is the order of the ancient world. The first group to appear was the Hyksos. They were Semitic, and they brought with them Bronze Age technology, the use of bronze to make weapons, chariots, and other artifacts. And this allowed them to infiltrate Egypt and gain a toehold there. Eventually, the Egyptians rose up and used the technology introduced by the Hyksos and turned it against them and drove them out of the Nile Delta. And this ushered in the new kingdom. Now, one of the kings, pharaohs, I want to introduce you to is a man named Akhenaten. His first name was Abenhotep, but he changed it to Akhenaten. It is well with Aton. He tried to impose for the first time in history the concept of monotheism, the belief in one God. Remember what I was telling you about Osiris and Isis and Amun-Re? The Egyptian culture was polytheistic. But this one pharaoh with his queen, Nefertiti, supposedly the most beautiful woman to ever live on earth, imposed their will and told the priests and the people that all of these other gods that you're worshiping would no longer exist. This did not go over well with the Egyptian. The moment that Akhenaten, at the death of Akhenaten, the Egyptian reverted back to their polytheistic ways, to believe in more than one god and goddess. But under the rule of Akhenaten, he forced the Egyptians to believe in one God, monotheism. Now, Akhenaten work was undone by his son, Tutankhamun, sometimes called King Tut. He was a sickly young man, of course, in these families because of incest and intermating of family members. The offspring would be deformed or sickly, and Tutankhamun is one of those individuals. But we remember him because his tomb was discovered, and we've seen the mass of gold and jewelry attached to the boy king, King Tut. You can Google him for more information. So he restored the dynasty and established order in the new kingdom, but other invaders would come. The sea people, these would be called from Palestine. Now, they would eventually settle back after they was driven out of the Nile Delta. In Palestine, these would become the Philistines. Remember Philistine, David and the Goliath, the slingshot, and the Hebrews. We'll talk more about them later. The new kingdom expired with the end of the 20th dynasty in 1085 BC. For the next 1,000 years, despite periodical revival of strength, Egypt was dominated by the Libyans from the west, the Nubians, these are black people from Sudan and from Kenya, from Ethiopia, the Persian, and finally the Greeks, after being conquered by Alexander the Great and eventually by the mighty Roman Empire. So that's Egypt. And what a wonderful story to tell. I will record another video sometime this week to look at the people who was connected to this Egyptian civilization and some of its invaders. But eventually the kingdom fell, and this created a vacuum for other groups to rise up and become powerful. So the next lecture will be on the Phoenicians, the Hebrews, and the Persians and the Assyrians, and that will complete chapter 2. Now, after next week, when we do chapter 3 on India, we will have our first exam. I will send you a notice. I will post the study guide, but we have complete chapter 1, 2, and 3 before the first exam. If you have any questions, feel free to text me, call me, or send me an email. Other than that, this complete this section on the Egyptian. Check back this week for this section on the Phoenicians, the Hebrews, the Assyrians, and the Persians. Be blessed and stay safe. Caver out.